With voice cloning, you can narrate your own content with your own voice. This includes making realistic voiceovers for podcasts, audiobooks, or personal assistants. In this video, I'll explain how to make high-quality voiceovers using just 20 minutes of audio. I'll start by explaining the basics of how text-to-speech models work. Then I'll cover dataset preparation, and last of all, explain how to fine-tune a model using that dataset you've prepared. If you are new to text-to-speech models, don't worry, because I will go through Jupyter Notebooks step by step from start to finish. And if you're more advanced, I'll describe in detail how I handle very challenging voices like my Irish accent. And here we go with text-to-speech. So I'll start off describing how to build a really simple model. And I'll do that with a few neural network approaches: transformers, diffusers, and generative adversarial networks. That's going to be useful because it will lay the foundation for explaining how to control style. And I'll explain how to tweak style in audio that's been generated in a naive way, and then I'll do it using the StyleTTS approach, or rather StyleTTS 2 actually. Then I want to highlight a little around how voice cloning works versus fine-tuning, what the differences are, the trade-offs when you might want to use one or the other, before getting into the meaty part of the presentation, where I'll run through a notebook for data preparation, and then one for fine-tuning the StyleTTS 2 model. And as usual, I'll finish off with a few final tips. So here's a very simple text-to-speech model. It takes in the quick brown fox, and it generates an output sound wave over here. Now, let's maybe make some quick pre-processing steps here on the input. So rather than just putting in text, we're actually going to split it into tokens, and that will go into our neural network. This should look familiar if you've done any work with things like Llama. You tokenize into subwords, and those subwords are what go into neural network. Now, because this is sound, you might want to tokenize not just with words or subwords, but with what are called phonemes. What are phonemes? Well, they're characters used to represent the sound of, the sound of different parts of words. So here, for example, we have, this is the sound the, quick, brown, and then fox. Now, these sounds here are easily generated. You can check a notebook like this one here I've linked. You can access it for free, where I import what's called a phonemizer, and then I put in the text through this phonemizer. You do need to tell it what language, and it will then create some phonemes. And these are the phonemes I got back out. And these are one-to-one representations of the sounds that are in words. And they, for example, if I make a sound like p, there's a specific phoneme that represents that. And you can see intuitively why that might be a useful representation if you want to finally generate a sound. Now, let's take a quick look at the right-hand side here, where we're generating a sound wave. And of course, we're going to generate what is our best estimate for the sound that represents the quick brown fox. And this generated best estimate is what I've shown here in red. And this red sound wave that we generate, we're going to compare to the actual sound wave that we presumably have in our training data set for the quick brown fox. And here I've just represented that, or a very small snippet of it, in blue. And the idea of this graph is to show you a comparison of the original wave with the generated wave. And that comparison is important because we need to grade the quality of our neural network and the quality of its outputs. And one simple way we can do that is just by comparing the distance between the red and the blue lines. More specifically, we could look at, say, mean squared error, which is just the difference between red and blue squared, and then averaged across all of the sound wave here. And that value, if it's large, it means there's a large discrepancy. And if it's 0, it means, well, we've matched the generated and the original. And so that value of the mean squared error, or of the loss, which is what we commonly call it, is useful because with that loss, or the calculated mean squared error, we can backpropagate through the neural network and update the weights to provide a higher quality neural network. And that's the idea of training these neural networks. You take some kind of input where you know what the truth is, the blue, you generate the red, you compare, you calculate how good or bad it is, which we call the loss, and you backpropagate that loss to update the quality of the neural network. And if you keep doing this and you've got enough data and you've got the right design for the neural network, in principle, you can eventually converge on a model that will produce a red line here that's pretty closely matched to the blue. Now, to make that specific, you might have a neural network that takes in up to 512 tokens. Maybe each token represents a phoneme. And perhaps this network is capable of producing 10 seconds of audio. So if you're producing 10 seconds of a sound wave at 24 kilohertz, 24 kilohertz means 24 sample points per second. That means the network would have to produce 240 output magnitudes to be able to represent 10 seconds of audio. Now, actually, if you have 512 input phonemes, that's probably closer to like a minute or more. So you would actually need more like maybe 6 times this, 1.5 million output magnitudes to be predicted in order to generate a sound wave. All right, so let's keep going deeper into how this model works. Here I've got some text input, phoneme representation, and I'm getting into more detail now on exactly what this neural network is. And I propose that it could be one of 3 things. It could be a transformer type network, could be a diffuser, or it could be a a generative adversarial network. So let me describe each one of these in series. The first is the transformer approach. Here I'm proposing, and I'm not saying this is a good idea, but just to understand the intuition around how you might do it, you could take some input text and tokenize it and input that into maybe a BERT or a llama model, which is a transformer. What do I mean by transformer? I mean a multi-layer neural network where each layer has got both attention and multi-layer perceptrons. What's attention? Attention is where you have a layer that pays attention to the previous tokens in the sequence, or the later tokens if it's bidirectional. And what's multi-layer perceptron? This is where we have what's called activation. Activation is SILU, GALU, ReLU. It's what makes neurons either output a really high value or else 0. It kind of turns inputs into outputs that look more like 0s or 1. And this is the core of transformers. They have typically got attention, and they typically have activation functions within multi-layer perceptrons. Now, I've described the transformer, but this second part here is also important because it's a linear layer that makes sure we get the right size of output. Remember, to make 10 seconds of audio at 24 kilohertz, we need to have 240,000 magnitude outputs. So if our transformer doesn't naturally generate that many outputs, we need to have some kind of transformation or final layer that's going to bring us to the necessary output we need to produce. And the way we would train this is we have some input text, we make a prediction in red, we calculate the difference with the blue, and we backpropagate and update the weights, not just in the linear layer, but also in the transformer. The second approach I want to cover is the diffuser approach, which is an approach that's used for making images as well in DALL-E or Stable Diffusion. This is the diffusion type approach, and hopefully you'll see the analogy when I describe it for sound. The easiest way to think about it is to consider starting off with a clean sound wave. This would normally be, say, a voice in a training data set. Here, though, I've just shown a simple sine wave because it's illustrative. And the first thing we do in diffusion training is we add a little bit of noise to that clean sound wave to get a moderately noisy sample. And then we add more noise to get a very noisy sample. So now we have these 3 samples. We have the clean training sound, the moderate noise, and the high noise. And we use these different levels of noise to train a neural network that's able to predict the noise going from one to the other. Specifically, we might take an input of this moderate noise sample, and knowing that corresponds, or knowing that the clean version corresponds to the quick brown fox, we will put those as inputs to a neural network that tries to predict the noise required to get back to a clean sample. And we will compare that prediction of noise to the actual difference between the input and the clean sample. And to the extent there's a difference between those two predictions, we'll use that error or loss to update the weights in the neural network. And you can see if we do this on many samples, this neural network will get better and better at predicting the noise that's present in this sample and needs to be removed in order to get back to this sample here. We can also do this training at multiple steps of noise. So we can do it going from clean, or we can do it from little noisy to no noise, or we can do it from very noisy to moderate level of noise. So here we take in a very noisy sample, we take in the underlying text represented, and we ask the network to predict the noise to get to a slightly less noisy sample. We compare the predicted noise to the difference between these samples, the actual difference, and we use the error, the model's error, to backpropagate and improve its prediction capabilities. Now, once this model is trained, and it's been trained to predict noise for various levels of various steps of the noise process, we can now move to inference, where we're trying to generate clean sound. And in inference, what we do is actually start off with pure noise. So we start with just maybe Gaussian noise or some other random type of noise, and with text that we want to generate. And we ask the neural network, okay, predict the incremental noise that should be removed to get to a slightly cleaner sample. And that allows us to get to a slightly cleaner sample, which hopefully matches the intermediate noise sample. And then we iterate. So we take that slightly better sample, again, tell it, here's the baseline text, predict the noise to get to an even cleaner sample. And then we get an even cleaner sample. And hopefully by going through every one of the steps, we get back to a final wave that is actually clean and represents the input text here. So this is diffusion, and it allows us to go from pure noise to a clean sample that represents the input text. And this is how image diffusion works too, except the noise here would be just pixelated noise. So you would start with random pixels in your image and ask the model to remove or clarify some of those, and then keep on removing noise until you get to a clean image out this end here. The third approach is generative adversarial networks, and this is probably the most popular approach to use for doing text-to-speech right now. Here you have some text coming in. Again, you tokenize it, maybe with phenomes, maybe with subwords or words, and you put it into some kind of neural net that we call a generator. We call it generator because it generates the sound. So nothing too different here than the transformer approach. It doesn't have to be a transformer though. Could be a convolutional neural network. It could be a residual network. Could be any of those types. But the key thing is we have one neural network that will generate the sound, and we have a second network that's called a discriminator. And the discriminator's role here is to take whatever the generator creates and compare it with the original sound and try to predict whether that sound is real or fake, or rather which one is real and which one is fake. And this is useful in two ways. First of all, it's useful because if the discriminator incorrectly thinks this original sound is fake, that means it is in error. And to the degree that it is in error with its predictions, we can backpropagate that error to update and improve this neural network. So the discriminator, by training it on generated versus original sounds and comparing those to the ground truth, by comparing its predictions to the ground truth, we can backpropagate its error in making those predictions to improve the network. But it's useful for a second reason, because if the generator is doing a really good job, it will be very difficult for the discriminator to discriminate between the generated and the original. So to the extent the generator is able to fool the discriminator, we can say the discriminator is a measure of its performance. Let me just say that differently. So if the discriminator is rarely fooled, that means the generator is doing a bad job. That means that the loss or the error of the generator is going to be high. Whereas if the discriminator is doing a bad job, in other words, it can't discriminate, that means the generator is doing a great job and the generator's error is quite low. So actually the discriminator is a measure of the generator's performance and a measure of the error of the generator, which means we can use the discriminator to update the weights of the generator's neural network. And this is the idea of the adversarial network. It's adversarial because they both improve during the training process. The discriminator improves itself by comparing to ground truth, but the discriminator gets better and better, and as it gets better, that means it will impose more of a loss upon the generator, forcing the generator to get better and better. Now, one of the drawbacks of these GAN networks, generative adversarial networks, is that you can get stuck at a local optimum. If you're somewhere and the discriminator is not really able to improve anymore. That makes it hard for the generator to improve. Now, having explained those three networks, the transformer, diffuser, and generative adversarial network, what I want to point out is that at no point here have I explained how voice cloning works. I've simply explained how to generate a voice based on input text. In fact, if you train a model like this, the voice you get is going to be some average of the voices that are in your dataset. Maybe there'll be some dependence on the input text. For example, if the input text is American spelling, maybe your output sound will be slightly more American voice because that's the type of voice you will tend to have matched with American spelling in your dataset. But this is not going to be good enough if you want to clone the accent of somebody or your own accent. It's not allowing you enough fine-grained control over the style. And that brings us to the next part of the video where I'll talk about how to control style. And I'll do that in a naive way and then in the StyleTTS2 type approach. If we want to control style, that means when we train a neural network, there needs to be some input that affects style. Probably the most naive way you could do this is to input a sound snippet. For example, you could take 1 second of a representative audio sound wave, and you could input then, if it's 24 kilohertz, that would be 240,000 magnitudes that you could just concatenate as an input alongside your input tokens that go into the model. And if you now train this model such that you have a representative sound snippet that is paired and relevant for the quick brown fox and relevant to the original output sound that will be used for comparison with the generated one, you're now going to have a model at the end where you should in principle be able to control independently the input text and the reference style here. Now you can extend this line of thinking and you could say, well, if I just want to control the pitch, I could have an input for pitch here, where the pitch is just the mathematically calculated pitch of a reference snippet sound. So if I train in this way, I'll be able to control the pitch that is associated with the sound I want to generate. Or you could control the speed. So you have a parameter here, it's just the signal magnitude and might be a normalized speed. And in inference, you'll then be able to control the speed. Now, if you want to make this a little more general, you can think about having a vector, maybe a 128 dimension vector that somehow represents the style. And this is now moving in the direction of the StyleTTS approach. How this could work is you take a reference snippet of audio and you pass it through an encoder, like a transformer, maybe BERT or Llama style, and you take an output, maybe it's a pooled average, but it's going to be a single vector, maybe, as I said, 128 dimensions, and that will represent the style of the reference snippet. And then that reference style will be used as an input for this neural network approach here that takes in the input text as well. Now, when you're training this overall network, you're going to forward pass and generate the sound compared to the original. And on the backward pass, you'll update not just your neural network setup, but you'll also be updating this style encoder here so that you more accurately are able to represent reference snippets as meaningful style vectors. Moving again to another level of complexity, you can take a look at the StyleTTS2 approach. And while this isn't the approach in full detail, I'll highlight the key aspects that make this StyleTTS2 as opposed to the more naive approaches. The first is that it uses a generative adversarial network. So as I described earlier on, in order to generate the output sound wave, it's using a discriminator and a generator. Now, importantly, in the StyleTTS2 approach, this discriminator is actually taken off the shelf. And that's a benefit because it means it doesn't need to be trained. It's already performing somewhat well when we start off the whole training. Now, where do you get an off-the-shelf discriminator? Well, there are models that are available, open source, like Whisper, for example, that will convert audio into text. So already those models are converting from a sound wave into some vector representation, and then they go from a vector representation back through embeddings into token representation. But if you rip off that last part, going from vectors to tokens, and you replace it with a classification head of real or fake, well, you've still got all of this kind of vector encoding that's going to be useful and pre-trained. So that's one of the ideas in StyleTTS. Instead of coming up and training from scratch a discriminator, why don't we use an off-the-shelf model that is just slightly modified by adding on this classification head that says real or fake at the end. Another benefit of using the generative adversarial network over using a diffusion type approach is that generative adversarial networks, usually they're once through and they make a prediction, whereas diffusion approaches are step by step, making them a bit slower during generation. Now this generative adversarial network, it takes in two broad types of information. The first is a style vector, which controls the style of the output, and the other is textual information. Now, it's not raw text that goes in, it actually gets converted into phonemes, as I described earlier, and then gets converted into a vector representation using a BERT type of encoder. So actually what goes in here is a vector representation of the words, but this is still textual information, and this here is style information, and combining these two, it's able to generate a sound. Moving a little further upstream, in order to get the style vector, StyleTTS2 uses a diffusion approach. So it diffuses out the style vector from noise. It starts off with just a random vector, and it will diffuse from that random vector into a clean vector representing style. And what guides that diffusion is not words, it's two different things. The first is the reference snippet, so that comes in here as an input. And the second is textual information, which again, like with the acoustic encoder here, the text is not sent in as text, but rather sent in as a vector representation of that text that has gone through a BERT type encoder here essentially. So this style is diffused out by taking in a combination of information from the reference audio and from the text. Now, why does that make sense? Well, when you hear audio like I'm speaking right now, it's going to be a function of two things. It's a function, first of all, of me, Ronan, and the accent I have, but it's also a function of the words I'm saying. If I'm talking about the sad man was weary on a somber day, then those words are going to be more somber, and so the words affect my style. And of course, when you have a reference snippet, that underlying text, the underlying text for that snippet is not the same as the text you're generally trying to create. And so you need to have a combination of information on, well, what is the accent and the style of the speaker, but also what is the topic they're talking about. And by combining those two, you need to get to what the right style vector is for that given approach. And so this is a very loose description of how StyleTTS2 works. There is more complexity I'm not showing. For example, actually the gained adversarial network takes in information on the pitch, which is obtained from the reference snippet and from the phonemes. It takes in information as well on the energy level, and it also takes in information on the duration that should be assigned to each of the phonemes. And that duration information is basically extracted from a combination of the reference snippet and again, the input text. But in broad terms, you can just think of it as taking in style information, taking in text-based information, albeit in vector form, and then generating directly a sound wave, generating magnitudes that are required for a given sampling rate and a given duration of output sound. With that, it's time to talk a little bit about voice cloning versus fine-tuning. So voice cloning, I mean, probably people have different meanings for exactly what that could be, but one interpretation is that voice cloning is where you simply take a reference snippet from a voice, and by inputting that during inference, you get the output snippet. And if you do it that way, once you have the pre-trained model, it's quite simple. You just need a few seconds or maybe 30 seconds, depending. But it's going to be a short snippet and you don't need to do any fine-tuning. It's literally just an input that's being provided along with text and generates an output sound. Now, the StyleTTS2 models are trained on a wide variety of voices. So if your input sample is roughly within the accent set of those voices, then StyleTTS2 is probably going to work fairly well. However, if you have an Irish accent and there's literally no Irish data within the training data set, or there's very little, then whatever style vector is being generated, that's probably just going to be out of the data set. It's going to be out of the norms for the model, and it's going to be difficult to get a voice that sounds like it. So in general, for text-to-speech models, if you have a model that's good with American accents and you want to try do an Irish or an Indian accent, it's probably going to be difficult just because there's not a whole lot of that data in the data set. And so if you're doing voice cloning, if it does work and you're roughly in the data set, it's nice because it's fast. It requires no fine tuning, but it is limited to accents within that data set. Whereas if you have an accent that's not in the data set, that's when you need to fine tune. You need to literally update the parameters that are in these models, and you need to update them so that they're more familiar with the data set that you want to impose. This means that it's a bit more slow. It requires some continued training. However, it is going to generate high quality samples, especially if you have a unique accent. And this is what I'm going to show you today, prepare a data set with my accent, with my voice from the Trelis YouTube. And let's see how we can get a model to be fine-tuned with that. And then I'll show you through inference how you do voice cloning just using a little snippet. Before I show you the notebooks for doing dataset preparation, just a few notes on what we're going to go for. I'll say this now, you might not catch it all, but hopefully you'll catch it then on the second time when we go through the notebook line by line. As with fine-tuning for any AI model, we need high quality data, and that means having high quality audio, ideally 48 kilohertz, even though we'll downsample to 24. And you want to have minimal noise as well. The next thing is we're going to segment that data into maximum length snippets. The core of StyleTTS 2 involves a lot of BERT type models, which have 512 tokens as their inputs. So we need to measure how long our snippets are within the raw data, and we need to break it into segments that are no longer than 502 tokens. This turns out to be about 1 to 2 minutes of audio for every segment. Now, how you chop those segments is important as well. You don't want to chop segments of audio so that you end up in the middle of words or in the middle of phenomes. You do want the audio to be aligned very well with the text as well. This can be done using a model like WhisperX, which not just transcribes your audio into text, but will also look at things from a phenome level. So it will match the audio with every puff. Like if you say P, it's going to align that P up with the P sound in the audio. Another key point is you want to have segments started with 200 milliseconds before every phenome that's being pronounced and finished 200 seconds after every last phenome. In other words, you don't want the audio to be starting right when I say P. You want to include maybe 200 seconds of buffer before, and you don't want audio snippets to end at the end of me pronouncing a certain phenome. You want it to end with a little bit of padding at the end. Not silence, I mean you actually want to include the 200 milliseconds of audio afterwards. And last of all, if you have words where there are very small gaps between them, well, you probably don't want to include the full 200 milliseconds of padding there because you will accidentally include a portion of the next phenome. So the approach you can take is to split in half the gap between those two and just include half of the gap, because hopefully then that won't include any of the next phenome and avoid any overlap. Now, just before I get started, I want to show you all the materials that you will need for doing the fine-tuning. First of all, there's the paper here, which I will link in the description. I just want to note here around the author's notes around potential misuse. So they have requested that users inform those listening to samples synthesized by StyleTTS 2 that they're listening to synthesized speech, or obtain informed consent around the use of the sample synthesized. So I do want to respect those restrictions or guidances that are provided by the authors. Now, there are two repositories that you can make use of if you want to do the fine-tuning and dataset preparation. The first is the repo prepared by the authors of this paper. It's a free repository that you can use online. And the second, as is typically the case with these Trelis videos, is the Trelis repository, which is Trelis Advanced Transcription. And you can purchase that for a once-off fee for lifetime membership. And it contains the customized notebooks that I'll go through today. Just so you have the link, and I'll put this in the description below, here is the StyleTTS 2 GitHub repo containing scripts around dataset preparation and fine-tuning. And here is the paid lifetime access repo. This is advanced transcription. It previously was used when I did the video on speech to text. So it contains all of the scripts for fine-tuning whisper models if you want to convert from speech of different accents into text cleanly. And now it contains a folder here called text-to-speech that provides an overview of the StyleTTS 2 model, as well as custom scripts around dataset preparation and fine-tuning, like I'll be going through today. So let's head over to the dataset curation script that I have here. And I recommend that you run this in Colab, especially if you want to download data from YouTube, because Colab seamlessly interacts with YouTube, whereas you have to log in if you're going to do it outside of Colab, and it can lead to restrictions on downloading that data set. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to download the audio from a YouTube video from the Trelis top 10 tips for fine-tuning video. You can check that out if you like. It's primarily around LLM fine-tuning. But I'll take that audio, which is about 25 minutes in length, and split it into chunks, chunks that are just under 512 tokens in length. And then I'm going to push those chunks of text, rather in phenome form, up to Hugging Face Hub, along with the WAV files, which are the sound files that go along with them. So we'll take this step by step, maybe increasing the size of the screen by a little bit more. A few installations required first. We have some libraries here necessary for converting to phenomes, like eSpeak, Phenomizer. We're going to use PyTube actually. I think we're going to use YouTube DLP, so we'll see that installation down below for doing for finding the YouTube videos. So after those installations are all done, we're going to create some folders, and we will want folders here for the segmented audio, and we'll want a folder for the SRT file. That is going to be the transcription of the audio I'll download from YouTube. So I'll start with just audio and convert that to audio and text, because remember, we need both audio and text for doing the fine-tuning. And there'll be a folder here for audio. So yeah, as I said, we're going to use YouTube DLP. You can maybe use PyTube, but I find there are issues with that sometimes for downloading. So I've installed YouTube DLP, and that allows me to download a video. Here I have the Trelis research video on top 10 tips. So that file has been downloaded, and if I check out here on the side of my screen, I should have the audio, and you can see here the file has been downloaded, which is top 10. You'll be just requested for the name, and I put in the top 10, and that's how it's going to save the file. Now it's actually downloaded as MP3. It says MP4 there, but it's really MP3. And then we want to convert that into WAV, because that's the typical format that's used for training. So here it's being converted to WAV, and the original MP3 I think was deleted. So the next step, now that we have the audio, is to transcribe it. And you'll recall I have a video on Whisper where I fine-tune Whisper. It's a transcription tool for going from audio into text. Now Whisper X is a slight modification on that, and it improves in two ways. First of all, it slices out silence in the WAV or the WAV file, which results in reducing noise. Basically, what I mean by silence is when there's no text or there's no actual speech, it will remove that. And the second thing is it uses a phenome model, or a phoneme model. I keep saying phenome, but it uses a phoneme model to get word level timestamps. So if it hears the p sound, it will get a specific timestamp for that. And that's very useful for aligning the text and the audio. And that's further useful for us, or rather as a consequence, that's useful for us because we can cleanly snip the audio into small groups. So we're going to transcribe the audio using Whisper X, and it will be transcribed into SRT format. Just to give you a quick look at SRT, this is what it looks like. It has timestamps and it has the text. And as I mentioned, it's phoneme aligned. So here, this very specific timestamp of 3 seconds and 372 milliseconds should correspond to the for sound. And that alignment allows us to cleanly snip between all of those. So it looks like I have converted to SRT. And next, I'm going to split it up into segments. Now, to be able to generate segments, we need to have a way to, we need to understand rather how the model is eventually going to tokenize. And the tokenization is, it's kind of simple, but it's kind of complicated for the StyleTTS 2 model. So let's just take a look here. Basically what it does is it's trying to convert the input text into a dictionary of the following symbols. So it has this symbol for padding, these punctuation symbols, these letters, and then it has these letters IPA, which include all sorts of symbols that are used for phonemes. So there's a dictionary that's been made by combining all of these symbols. Here you have the symbols, and that's converted into a dictionary. What does that mean, converting to a dictionary? It means assigning a number to each of the tokens in the dictionary. Now, this is a dictionary with a fairly low vocabulary size. For Llama, you often have like 30,000 tokens in the dictionary, or even Llama 3, I think there's 120 or 100,000. It seems that higher size vocabs are better. But this is a very low vocab size. I think it's in the order of 100 to 200. So the tokenizer, if you call it a tokenizer, it's a dictionary with a relatively small size. Now, there are a few steps involved in tokenizing, and what we're tokenizing is the input text. So if you remember in the SRT file, we're basically trying to create segments. So let me describe how it will work manually. If I have a limit of 512 tokens, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this first line, I'm going to add in the second line. So I'll put those two lines together, and I'll calculate now how many tokens I have there. If it's less than 512, I'll add in a third line. If that's still less than 512, I'll add in a fourth line. And I'll keep doing that until I have over 512. And once I exceed it, I'll go back and say, okay, don't add that last one. Let's just stop, because now I have a segment that's 512. But to do that, I need to be able to calculate tokens, and that's what's happening here. So to calculate tokens in a string of text, there are a series of cleaning steps. And after cleaning, it's then converted. So the text cleaner will clean it up, removing excess padding and things like that. And eventually then it will go through the dictionary, where we convert from the raw text into this dictionary of tokens. And then lastly, we're able to count those tokens. So these are roughly the steps involved. It's easiest just to look through an example. We have hello world, and that is going into this function to count the tokens. And you can see here are the tokens coming out. And notice how it is actually being converted into phonemes first. So there's kind of a phoneme here for hello world. And this is then being split into individual tokens of that dictionary. So here we've 18 tokens. There were actually, I think, 17 phonemes. And this is basically how we count the number of tokens. Now, once we can count the number of tokens in a given string, we can run that script on the SRT file that I just described, where you keep adding lines until you get to 512 as your target. Now, when we create those segments of 512 in text, we also save the corresponding audio. So we also concatenate the audio to get to that segment of text. And then we also add in padding at the start and the end of 200 milliseconds, so that the segments don't start off with a p sound or a phoneme sound, and they don't end like right at the end of a phoneme sound. There's also a little audio included before and after. And as I mentioned before, if the gaps between segments are really small and less than 200 milliseconds, we take half of the gap as the padding distance. So here you can see I had an error running, and that's because I need an SRT file and an audio file. I do have them, but I need to just go up here and rerun again the directory creation. Make sure that those directories are present as expected. So with that, we can run the script, and you can see that we are now generating these segments of text that are all below 512 tokens. So you can see we've got about 50 segments here. And if you want to very quickly go through the script, you can see how it's basically iterating through lines in the SRT file, adding buffer to the very start of the clips, and it's counting the tokens. And if you're below a threshold, so here it's iterating through the lines of the SRT file. If you're above the threshold of 512, it's going to break and move. And if it's below, then it's basically going to combine the next snippet of text onto it. So this is the script in total for making those segments. And once we have the segments, we can optionally add in padding. So we can add silence to the start and the end. I think if you have properly added padding as I described with 200 milliseconds end and start, there shouldn't be any needing for adding any further padding. So actually I've set the padding here to 0, which means it will just add the files to the padded audio folder, but it's not actually going to add any padding. Now you can listen to some of the snippets if you like. So that's just a snippet of my voice. And you can also calculate the duration. So here I'm going to run this cell and it's telling me I have 20 minutes of audio in total across the snippets. The longest snippet is top 10_12 and it's 30 seconds. And the length in frames is 581. Now, what's the length of frames and why is that important? Well, actually the audio in the StyleTTS model, it's not inputted ever as a WAV format. It's also not imported as a pure wave. So it's not imported as 24 kilohertz for 10 seconds or 30 seconds. That's not the raw input it goes into. Rather, it's converted into the frequency domain. So that's done through a Fourier transform. And actually, it's then shifted into the human range for audio, which means converting it to a MEL spectrogram. So the input format is not just a raw wave. It's not just a raw waveform. It's this log MEL spectrogram format. And these MEL spectrograms are frequency representations. They're done for frames of the input audio. So actually that 30 seconds is split into many overlapping frames. The way these frames are set up, you have a sampling rate of 24 kilohertz. So that's the raw wave. And then the length of the frames in terms of how long a frame spans is going to be 1,200 samples. So based on this, we're able to calculate how many frames that we have in a given sample of audio. And this is important because when we get to setting some hyperparameters in the fine-tuning, we need to set the maximum number of frames that are going to be generated by the model. And so we need to know what the maximum frame length is of the sound that we're going to be handling. And the logical way of thinking about this is our actual limit is going to be on the input length of the sequences to the birth type models. So that's the 512. So we're ultimately limited in how long we can put in samples. We're limited by the 512. And then once we get those segments, we can calculate what the maximum number of frames is. And that allows us to set the maximum number of frames in the hyperparameters. Now, there's a point here to do with training that's probably subtle at this point, but is important later. Basically, you want to have samples that are as long as possible. So we would love to actually have 30-minute samples going in. The reason we want longer samples is because it allows the model to get used to these longer-term dependencies. And it also allows it to represent things like the transitions between sentences. If you just train a model on single sentences, it's not going to be accurate in having the right pauses and intonation when you have two sentences. Likewise, if you train it on just two sentences that are together, it's not going to have the right intonation in going between paragraphs. So there are all these transitions, and the only real way you get the transitions nicely is by having input audio that's going to be long enough to cover all of these features. So like transitions between sentences, between paragraphs, between potentially chapters in books and things like this. So we would love to have longer frames, but the reason we can't, or not longer frames, but longer samples. The reason we can't have longer samples is because we're limited by the max sequence length of the encoders that we have, that 512. Now there is another limit we'll get to later, which is that there is a limit on the VRAM. So the longer the audio segment that we generate, the more VRAM, so the more memory we need in our GPUs. And ultimately that's going to limit the maximum number of frames and the batch size that we can have during the fine-tuning. So for now, what's important to know is we've generated the maximum length sequences that we can, and we've noted what the frame length is of those max sequences, or the number of the length in the frames, and we're going to use that later on to set as a hyperparameter in the fine-tuning. At this point, we have generated some output text. I'm going to find that output text and show you an example. It's probably easiest to look at it here. Training data and output text. So here's what we've got so far. We've this output text, which consists of the WAV file, followed by the raw text. And then at the end, there's actually this number, which just represents the speaker number. These are all ones because it's not a multi-turn conversation. It's just a single turn. So that's going to be 1, or it could be 0, but it's the same number because it's the same speaker. So as I said, we have this text that's here, but actually the model expects inputs of phonemes. So as a last step in creating our data, we need to convert this text into phonemes, which is what this script here will do. So I've just run the script here, and it's going to process all of that output, and it's going to convert it into a training data set and a validation data set. And you can see this is the very same, except these are now phonemes instead of being just word representations. And now the last step is simply to push this up to Hugging Face Hub. Here I'm pushing up Trelis Voice 512, just because the max token length is 512. And I can take a look here at what that dataset looks like. It's a public dataset if you want to check it out. You can see it lists the WAV files, then it's got the phonemes, and then it's got the speaker number. And if you look at the files here, you can see we have the train list, the val list, and we have a list of the WAV files here. So we're at a point now where our dataset is ready. We have audio, we have matching segments of text, and we're ready to move to fine-tuning. Next, we're going to move on to the fine-tuning notebooks. Now, for running these, I recommend having a minimum of 48 gigabytes of VRAM. I'm actually going to run with 80 gigabytes of VRAM by using an A100. If you want, you can use a one-click fine-tuning template from RunPod. So if you head to this Trelis, it's an affiliate link which supports the channel. So if you're happy to use that, you can click the link and it will set you up with a one-click CUDA 12.1 template, and you can select maybe this 48 gigabyte option for the 6000. In fact, you can use the A6000 here, RTX A6000, or you can select an A100 if you want 80 gigabytes of VRAM, and that's what I've done here. So I'm up and running on that instance, and I've opened up Jupyter Notebook, and I'm just running some of these installations now. And I will get them going so that I can explain them one by one to you. Okay, so the very first step is to clone the StyleTTS 2 repository from GitHub and install some of the packages that are needed, including Torch Audio. We need Transformers, Phonemizer, Hugging Face Hub, HF Transfer to accelerate uploads and downloads of models. The default is to use TensorBoard, but I've got scripts set up for weights and biases. I don't necessarily think it's better, but I am used to it, so I'm going to use that. Also, if you want to do LoRa instead of full fine-tuning, there's a PEFT installation that you need to run as well. So with all of those installed, we're going to change directory CD into the StyleTTS folder. So, by the way, I should have mentioned I uploaded, first of all, this Trelis StyleTTS 2 fine-tune demo notebook, which is from the Trelis Advanced Transcription repository. Then I cloned the StyleTTS 2, and now within that folder, I'm going to download the model that we're going to train. And the model we're going to train is this LibreTTS model, and we're going to target this checkpoint here. Let me increase my screen size a little bit to make this easier. So we have the model and it should be downloaded by now. And you can see that I've already done a full fine tune earlier. So here, we're now going to download the data set that we need for doing the fine tuning. So for that, we'll need to log into Hugging Face and get the token if it's a private data set. Now, this data set is actually public, so there is no need to log in. And then we'll be able to download it into this Trelis data folder. So all of those files look like they've been downloaded. And if we check here in Trelis data, you can see the train and validation files. And you can also see a list of the WAV files ready here. So we're going to make sure that we're in the StyleTTS 2 folder. We already are, so that's why that error is showing. And we're going to load the config file, which is used for setting the hyperparameters for the fine tuning. So that's the file that's in configs and then config.ft. And what we're doing here is we're updating some of these parameters because well, that's needed for the fine-tuning. So first of all, we're going to make sure that the root path is pointed to the sound files in the Trelis data, and also that the training data and val data are pointing to the right TXT files. Because I'm using weights and biases, I've set up a project name, StyleTTS 2, that all of my runs are going to be in. And next, I'm going to configure how many epochs I'm going to train for. Now, I find that you can actually get decent results, even training just on 2 or 3 epochs. 4 or 8 goes well. It seems to be convention to train on way more, like 30 or 50. So you can always try out doing more. To me, that seems, coming from kind of large language model perspective, that seems to be excessive. But maybe that just makes good empirical sense for text-to-speech models. As I said, though, the results are not bad, even if you fine-tune on a lower number of epochs. So here I've selected 8 epochs. I'm actually, just for the sake of this fine-tuning, I'm going to reduce that to 4. Next is my batch size. So this is how many batches of data I'm going to use for training, and this affects my VRAM. So you can't set this too high because you'll run out of VRAM. The minimum that the code supports is a batch size of 2. You'll hit errors if you try to do anything larger than that. I recommend 2 for an A600. You probably could go up to more, maybe 3 for an A100. The problem is that this model takes quite a lot of memory because it's a float 32 model. So this is going to be fairly memory hungry, especially if you're not using LoRa. And even with LoRa, it will reduce your VRAM a bit, but still a lot of the modules are being fully fine-tuned, so you're not saving VRAM that much. Now, next up is this max len parameter. This is the max frames of input. And this is important because it also affects VRAM. And this is where we need to go back and look at how many frames we have in our data set. So you'll remember we have a maximum length of 581 frames. And for that reason, I'm going to set the max length here to 600. The code is then going to pad out the rest of those frames. So it'll just add padding to all of my samples. Now, from a training quality and efficiency standpoint, you ideally want your segments to be just under the 600 frames because you don't want to have a lot of padding. That's just wasted compute. And so that's why when I did the creation of segments, I wanted them all to be just up towards the limit of the 512 input tokens, which means they'll also be up towards the limit of the frames in terms of audio length. Now, there are 2 parameters here that are important for controlling the training. So I'm going to show these graphically by going back to my oversimplified representation of the StyleTTS 2 model. Basically, when we fine-tune this model, everything is being fine-tuned at once. So things like the encoders are being fine-tuned. But there is a control as to when you want to turn on fine-tuning of the diffuser, and there's a control as to when you want to turn on the adversarial training here in the generative adversarial network. And the way it's controlled is through epochs. So here, this is saying the diffusion is going to turn on at epoch 2. Now, I think it's 0-based counting. So when I set this to 2, I think it will turn on for the 3rd epoch. And here I set this to 4. So it means that the adversarial training will turn on at 4. And I'm actually just going to modify these down a little bit because I'm running fewer epochs. But you need to make sure that these numbers are less than the total number of epochs. Otherwise, your diffusion training and your adversarial training is just not going to turn on. Save frequency just means how often you save the model. This is 1, so once every epoch. That might be too much. For example, you could just save it on the final epoch by saving it to 4. The next parameter here of interest is the batch percentage. This controls the amount of out of distribution data that's going to be used during adversarial training. So generally the data that's going to be used is what's in the Trelis data folder. But for adversarial training, you can throw in some other examples that are not in your core data set. And for now, the way that things are set up, it's going to pull those samples from the data folder, which will be the original samples that were used in the LibreTTS model. So these are the out of distribution texts that are going to be used in order to do the adversarial training. Now, you don't have to run adversarial training, but if you do, you should go and check what's in your data folder. So I've downloaded a different set of data here, the LJ speech dataset just by running this snippet of code here. Make sure to first delete the data folder because it contains older data. But this will then download a set of training and validation and WAV files that go along with it. Continuing on here with the parameters, if you're going to use LoRa fine-tuning, set this to true, otherwise leave it as false. And if you're going to use LoRa, you have to set the alpha and LoRa OR. I have selected these so that they're roughly appropriate for the size of model that is in play here. Now, all of this script here simply provides a weights and biases run name that will include like the number of epochs and information that helps you track the run's performance. So when I go ahead and run this, and first I need to make sure my config file is loaded. So when I run that, it should basically rewrite my config file to be updated with the parameters I've just chosen. And next I'm going to log into weights and biases. So here I'm just going to select weights and biases, and that should allow me to log in. Next, I need to upload some fine-tuning scripts. So that is going to be done by taking the scripts from the Trelis Advanced Transcription repository. Didn't mean to create that cell. I meant rather here in the StyleTTS2 folder, I'm going to go to the folder within Advanced Transcription. So here I'm in Advanced Transcription in the text-to-speech folder. I've git cloned the Advanced Transcription repo, and I'm going to upload Trelis Train Fine-tune, which is for full fine-tuning, and Trelis Train LoRa Fine-tune, which is for LoRa fine-tuning. Of course, you only need one of them, and I've uploaded them earlier, so I'm just going to dismiss that. Now I'm ready to go ahead and do the fine-tuning. So I'm going to get started with that, and we should see weights and biases kick off, and I can click on the link to see the run underway. Now it's going to load a series of models. You can see that there are encoders being loaded, and you can see there are the different sound wave files being loaded as well. And you can check out here the current run. The run is in green, and you can see some earlier runs as well. I'll just hide some of the runs apart from one I did yesterday for 4 epochs, or rather it was 8 epochs yesterday. And you can see here the training is progressing. Here I have system information showing the percentage of GPU memory allocated. Here I have my training information, and here I have my evaluation loss. And you can see very roughly I'm tracking what was happening yesterday. Now, what we should expect is that because of my settings, basically my diffusion losses, so losses associated with the diffuser, should only turn on at epoch 2, whereas my losses associated with the adversarial training should only turn on at epoch 3, or after 2 epochs. So that's what we'll expect to see when we look at the training data, and indeed it is. You can see here, first let's find the diffusion loss on the second page. So yeah, after just 1 epoch, you can see that the diffusion loss has started, and it's falling nicely, which is what you want. You can also see that the style loss, because the style is an output of the diffuser, that's only starting to appear after 1 epoch. And meanwhile then, for the adversarial loss, you can see that is starting here in green. Gen loss SLM and DLoss SLM are both related to the adversarial loss. So we're just seeing those appear after 2 epochs. And you can see my run yesterday, where I ran for 8 epochs. I started the diffusion loss, I think at epoch 2 or 3, and I started the adversarial loss later at halfway at around epoch 4. So that's why you can only start that, see that starting to appear. And what you're looking for generally is you want the losses, of course, to be trending down over time, which they generally are. Note that the adversarial losses are very noisy. So that indicates potential room for improvement there, maybe by training for more epochs or more carefully examining the data. Now, the MEL loss, this is like the frequency analysis of the sound wave being generated. You can see this is very, very jumpy. Now, it's not helping that my batch size is 2. It would be nice if I had larger batch size, but I really need more VRAM for that. An alternative would be to code in gradient accumulation, so you only backpass after averaging over the losses for a number of batches. So definitely room for improvement here on the performance of the MEL loss. Looking over at the style loss, you can see a very significant improvement. The train gen loss here is also improving over time. So generally speaking, we can see material improvement in the performance of the model throughout these training epochs. Now, the training should be done here for this limited period of 4 epochs. I think it's just saving the model. And so now we can move on to testing the model. To run inference, there are a few different functions that need to be set up. There's a function here that does the masking. So this will basically add padding to the max length of the samples. Wave pre-processing. This is actually an example of where we take in a raw wave and we convert it into a MEL spectrogram, which means getting its frequency representation. And furthermore, that is converted into a log MEL spectrogram. By the way, MEL means that the frequency is further adapted to be relevant to the human ear range of frequencies. Compute style. So this is a function that will take in the path to an audio file and it will output a style vector. Namely, it's using a style encoder in order to create an output vector. And there's also a predictor encoder. This is for duration prediction, duration being the length of phonemes, a phoneme being like the sound p, duration being the length of that sound p. There's actually prediction for how long each of the phonemes that are generated should last, how many frames they should last. We have a check then to make sure that the models are all moved onto CUDA, which is using the GPU. Now, if you have fine-tuned using LoRa, you can at this point run this series of cells. This will allow you to load the base model that you fine-tuned and then apply the LoRa adapters and merge them in and then save them as a merged LoRa model. However, we have fine-tuned a model fully, so I'm going to load the fully fine-tuned model. It's been saved to the LibreTTS FFT folder. You can see here there are 8 epochs that were saved. And 3 minutes ago, this 4th epoch was saved because it's zero-based counting. So these are the 4 other epochs I ran yesterday. So here you're able to select the path to that file, and it's going to load up various of the encoders and models. Like here, for example, is your pitch extractor. F0 refers to pitch. Here's a BERT model used for encoding. So all of the individual models are being loaded up from this .pth file. So I'm going to go ahead and run that. And I'm going to sort through the files, print out the sorted files. It's just going to print all of the files in this folder. And what I'm going to do then is select the last file. I'm actually going to go back. So I'm not going to pick this last one, but 1. I'm going to 2, 3, 4, 5. I want to pick this 5th from last file. So we will load up the parameters from the model I've just trained now, just so you can see what 4 epochs does. That model will be loaded. It's got kind of a wrapper that's called net. So I'm just going to unwrap that wrapper from it. And if you wish, you can print through and see what that model looks like. You can see there are all of the different model types. Like here's a diffuser, here's the pitch extractor, style encoder, predictor encoder, decoder, text encoder. So yeah, it's quite a complex model when you look at all the pieces. We're going to load up the sampler. So this is the diffusion sampler here. And now we're going to move towards defining the inference function. So the inference function will take in text we want to convert to speech. It will take in a reference style vector. So we'll first compute a style vector for the reference audio and then input that into the inference. We have alpha, beta, diffusion steps, and embedding scale. The embedding scale I recommend just keeping to 1. It's for normalizing the length of embeddings. Diffusion steps affects quality. I recommend keeping that to 10. You can try lower if you like, but it's how many times you want to denoise before getting to the final sample. And what alpha and beta do is they blend the style of the reference with the baseline style of the model. So if you want to move your voice more towards your reference speech, like your short snippet, you should put alpha at a low value and beta at a low value. Specifically, these are going to blend 2 things. One is the style and the other is the prediction, I believe. So here we have the style S and ref is the predictor. So this is duration predictor. And we basically blend the style using beta and we blend the prediction using the alpha parameter. So yeah, I'd recommend probably keeping alpha and beta low if you want something compared to your reference style. Now, I will go through this inference code in a bit more detail, but it's actually easier if I start with the generation. So let's start off with generating some speech for this text. I'm going to walk you through 10 quick tips for fine-tuning. And I'm going to use a reference audio snippet, which is just the start of one of my Trelis videos. So that will serve as the reference. Now, what's happening here when we generate the output audio is we start off by creating some noise, because this noise is needed to diffuse out the style vector, and that style vector is then used as an input to our generator. So we start off with a path to our data, which is to our reference audio, and we're going to compute the style for that. So this here is the style vector that is coming out of the reference audio. And if you remember when we looked at the compute style function, I'll just pull it up here. So here's that compute style function again. And what it's doing is it's pre-processing the audio as I described into a log MEL spectrogram. And then it's running it through a style encoder to get a reference style and a predictor encoder to get a reference representation of the duration. So the duration is the length that we want for each of the phonemes that are being generated. So this is the compute style function. And once we have computed the style of that reference audio, we're going to input it to the inference function, which takes in the text and which also takes in the style. And it uses the text and the style with these weightings I described in order to generate the output. So I'm just going to run that. And in the meantime, I'll explain up here what's happening in the inference in more detail. So we take in the text, we take in the style, the encoded style. We clean up the text and put it into tokens. We mask the text, so put in padding where it's needed. We encode the text, and we actually encode the text in two different ways. One is we encode it to go into the GAN network, the Generative Adversarial network, and the other is we encode it because we'll want to use that information for the style diffuser. And this here is the style diffuser. It takes in the reference style that we inputted to the inference function. So it's taking in this reference style here. And it's also taking in an embedding, so a representation of the text. So it's trying to take any information on style that's present in the text. And it's going to diffuse that out from the noise into a clean vector. So that's going to provide a clean style vector. And actually the style vector has got a style component and it's got a duration prediction component. So that's just how StyleTTS 2 is set up. And when we have this diffused style and diffused prediction component, then the blending happens. So this is where we blend a portion of the reference style with the diffused style. And this allows you to control basically how much of the baseline model you want to add to your final sound wave versus how much of the style from the reference that you want to diffuse in. And as you can see, if you set alpha to be low, it's going to weigh it towards the reference here. If you set beta to be low, that means it's going to weigh it towards the reference here. And with that, essentially, you now gather all of the inputs. So you gather all of the style, you gather all of the textual information. There are some further operations here I won't describe in too much detail, but you finally will push that into the decoder, which is Hi-Fi GAN. Hi-Fi is high fidelity generative adversarial network. And finally, you're going to have a forward pass through the adversarial network, which is going to take in here. Basically, ASR is a representation of the text combined with the alignment and the style. F0 is the pitch information, N-pred is the energy level, and ref here is rather the style. So sorry, I misspoke there. ASR is the textual information, the aligned textual information, not the style. Ref here is the style. And then, as I said way back earlier in the PowerPoint, you have the noise, rather the pitch and the energy of the reference sample that are going in here as well. So with that, we have a prediction of the output sound. And I'm just going to play here a little reference. I don't know, hopefully you can hear it.
I'm going to walk you through 10 quick tips for fine-tuning.
And here is the synthesized.
I'm going to walk you through 10 quick tips for fine-tuning.
Okay, so you can see, not too bad. And one of the drawbacks with the synthesized sound is that it's actually a bit slower. Now that's something you can rectify with post-processing. I've done a very naive form of post-processing here, but it allows you to get a tiny bit closer. So here's the sped up synthesized audio. So again, the reference.
I'm going to walk you through 10 quick tips for fine-tuning.
I'm going to walk you through 10 quick tips for fine-tuning.
So you can see that there are definitely aspects of my voice. It's way closer than what you would hear if you loaded a raw model, which we can try in a second. It's not quite perfect, so there's opportunity to fine-tune for more epochs. I only did 4 epochs, but I think you can see that already with those 4 epochs, we're getting quite close in the result. Now at this point, you can decide to push the model to hub, so you can select a checkpoint that you want to push, and it will create a repository up on Hugging Face. Now, there are 2 things I want to cover before I wrap up in the script. The first is I've glossed over like detailed description of model losses, just categorizing them high level as diffuser loss, generative adversarial loss, or other losses. But you can find out a description here. The losses are described one by one versus what you see in the weights and biases or TensorBoard logs. So you can see a description of, say, the MEL loss, generator, discriminator, cross-entropy loss on the duration. So this here, if you want to have more information. Now, something else I want to do is show you the performance of a baseline model. So let's test out the model. I'm going to run through all of the inference scripts again, but this time, instead of loading up the fully fine-tuned model, I'm going to load up the base model. And actually, that code there is for the LoRa one. So what I'm going to do is instead, I'm going to copy out some code here, and I'm going to just adjust so that we read in models, LibreTTS, and the config file here is just called config.yaml. So let's load through. We can see there's only one sorted file that should appear. That's correct. So I have to pick out that last sorted file, load it up, make sure the model loads, load the diffuser, now run through inference, and finally synthesize that same speech. Now, just for interest, let's try to make it as close as possible to the reference, because I'm going to provide a reference. So I'm doing voice cloning here. I'm going to try clone my Irish accent. So let's run it in a way that is as close as possible to the reference. And here, it's not a fine-tuned model, so you'll just see how good or bad it is.
I'm going to walk you through 10 quick tips for fine-tuning.
All right, that was the reference.
I'm going to walk you through 10 quick tips for fine-tuning.
Yeah, so here it's clearly not getting much of the Irish accent just through voice cloning. So just putting in the reference voice is really not sufficient. And that shows you why you probably need to fully fine-tune or LoRa fine-tune if you're going to go for an accent that's not very close to what's in the raw data set. You can also notice there's a slight delay in the word fine-tuning, which isn't present in the fully fine-tuned version that I did. And that's probably because the word fine-tuning is not in the base training data set, but it is in my data set because I say it a lot in the Trelis videos. And that is pretty much an overview of the notebook for doing full fine-tuning or LoRa fine-tuning. With that, we're towards the end of the video and it's time for a few final tips. First of all, I recommend using a minimum of 20 minutes if you want to do fine-tuning. I used 20 minutes there and I trained for 4 epochs and I got reasonable results. But if you bump that up to about 2 hours and you start doing it for more epochs, you can get even better results, especially on the adversarial loss. Now, as I've said, you should think carefully about what out of distribution dataset you want to use for adversarial training. This will help the model to generalize a bit better beyond your single accent. But actually, you may not value the importance of generalization if you're just trying to hone in on one specific use case. So perhaps you might want to set your out of distribution data. You might just want to use more of, say, the Ronan voice in the case I was going through. Last of all, with regards to VRAM, this does impose a limit on the batch size, which means that your training loss can be somewhat jumpy. So it is beneficial if you can find ways to increase that batch size, even if it means increasing the virtual batch size by coding in some gradient accumulation. Alternatively, you can use a larger GPU. For example, there are 192 gigabyte GPUs available on RunPod. If you want to rent out an AMD GPU, now that isn't using CUDA, so it will require some testing out, but it's potentially an option if you want to try and run a larger batch size. And that is it for this video on text-to-speech fine-tuning. You can find links that I mentioned in the video down below in the description, including a link to trelis.com/advanced-transcription if you'd like to purchase access to the Trelis scripts or get lifetime access to the speech-to-text and text-to-speech repository. Additionally, I'd like to thank Rohan Sharma for his work helping on this video as part of the Trelis Internship program. If you're a very talented developer, you can find out more about that program at trelis.com up in the top section of the website. In the meantime, if you've any questions on text-to-speech fine-tuning, put them below in the comments. Cheers.